Hello, welcome back to Theatre Journal Shorts. I'm here today with Adin Walker to discuss An Epistemology of the Automobile, Fun Home, Queer Aging, and Lesbian Narrative Futurity on the Musical Stage. This article is published in Theatre Journal, Volume 78, Issue Number 2. That's our June 2026 issue. Hello, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Really excited to get started talking about your article. So I was wondering if you could start off by giving us a brief summary of the topic and your main argument in it.
Sure. So the article is titled An Epistemology of the Automobile, Fun Home, Queer Aging, and Lesbian Narrative Futurity on the Musical Stage. It really is a close reading of the musical adaptation of Alison Bechdel's 2006 graphic memoir called Fun Home, a Family Tragicomic. The musical is by Lisa Crone and Janine Tesori. And what I'm doing in this article is exploring how older Allison, who's this embodiment of the writer Alison Bechdel, is studying her father's life and his death in order to understand how to envision her own aging, her own future. So early in the musical, she's kind of sitting alone in her studio, uh, or she's alone. She's alone, and she starts to kind of reflect and remember her past, and she tells us in song. She says, "I'm the one who's 43. I'm stuck, just like you. Am I just like you?" So in that moment, she's recognizing how she is now turned to the age 43 that her father was when he actually committed suicide. We're going to learn throughout the musical that her father was gay. He was in the closet, and she's gay. And so as she turns that same age, she's starting to really look within herself and notice that she feels stuck. What does that mean? And that as she tries to understand her sense of stuckness, she has to kind of study his life and his stuckness so that she can kind of motion on. She can keep living. She doesn't seem interested in dying, or having kind of an end of life in the way that her father does. So I just got really interested in wanting to understand how this musical is a study of the closet, an epistemology of the closet in the really classic Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick sense. But I also want to understand how it's a study of her consciousness and her vision of the future. And so I ultimately suggest the musical explores an epistemology of the automobile, and it grounds this epistemology with respect to lesbian feminist cultural production and also coalitional politics. And so why the automobile? She doesn't actually drive in Fun Home. There's no like scene of her driving. Um, there are cars and automobiles kind of imagery in the musical, and I do write about that. But I attend to the automobile as another interior locale that's distinct from the closet. And what I like about the automobile is it has this kind of self-directedness to it. And that leads me to look at the experience of being in an automobile, of sitting in the driver's seat, and of being in the closet, where the closet is this experience of waiting that is static. It's a kind of waiting in stasis, waiting for things to change, or waiting to come out, or waiting for whatever it is. The kind of experience of living in the closet is one of waiting in stasis. The car, I know we think of it as like I'm getting in my car and going someplace, but it is about the journey from like here to there, or or a journey from here to somewhere. And I describe that as a waiting in motion. So both the closet and the automobile offer a frame of waiting, but I'm quite interested in what it means to really think about waiting in motion, and how that in some ways goes back to some really early debates in queer theory from figures like Jose Esteban Munoz, who write about queerness as this the not yet here, the orientation toward, as he writes, the horizon imbued with warm potentiality. So that the automobile offers a kind of um, a shape toward the cognitive, the psychic act, the emotional act of just moving toward that horizon, waiting in motion to someplace somewhere. I think what I want to also offer in this response is that part of what I do in the article is I situate um, like kind of a narrative theory of the automobile in relationship to the history of the stream of consciousness in literature. So, if we think about like literally the stream of being on a river raft or a boat and moving down the stream and how that stream allows for a kind of free flowing stream of consciousness, um, I'm interested in the road. So, what is the road in relationship to the stream, and how the act of driving kind of opens up the mind and the imagination in deep ways. Um, and so, I actually do situate specifically the musical of Fun Home to kind of other theatrical mise en scenes like that of Paula Vogel's play How I Learned to Drive. And I attend there to similar issues across both works of agency and also of trauma theory. How in Vogel's play, the car is a vehicle for integrating the unprocessed events and of offering the character a capacity to really kind of we might say like master the narrative or kind of placing the traumatic incident, the unprocessed event into a kind of rear view mirror so that she can ride off into the sunset. So there's a way in which the car becomes this crucial structure, narrative structural condition for the play that's both grounded in a specific history of the character and her own experience with aging and with abuse, but then also with the kind of psychic processes that we do and that we labor to do as we keep motioning on. Um, and then with Vogel, I'm also turning to other cars. There's a moment of some Thelma and Louise. There's a citation or footnote about split britches as lesbians who kill. But then ultimately, I actually turn to a scene of David Warnerovich in 1989. After he's been diagnosed with HIV, he drives cross country, and in his tape journals, he records some of his own stream of consciousness thoughts while he's driving and listening to Tracy Chapman's 1988 song Fast Car. And here I'm drawing on really beautiful transcriptions that Sarah Marcus made in her fantastic book called Political Disappointment, uh, a cultural history from Reconstruction to the AIDS crisis. And I'm then turning to the scene of Warnerovich listening to Chapman to Fast Car, to also think about driving and dying and what it is to how the car offers the capacity to really contain the uncontainable, which can be about life and living and grief and ultimately motioning on toward the future's known unknowns, which includes the collective condition of dying. So the automobile becomes a way to also be facing the challenges of of humanity and of the future that include the fear of the unknown. And finally, what I'll just say is I also find the car to be a useful way of thinking about coalitional politics. So in the article, I cite some moments in Alison Bechdel's in her comic series Dykes Walked Out For, where she actually has a scene of a car and a group of her friends are traveling across the country to participate in a protest during the AIDS crisis. And so the car becomes this really important object for actually bringing people together across wide distances to participate in collective politics, to participate in activism, to march together. And so I'm interested in, even though the closet is this like very isolating individual scene of waiting in stasis, the car, it can be, the scene of me driving alone, but also a scene of me driving in the car where I'm bringing others along for the ride. And what does it mean to think of the shape of the car toward queer coalitional movements also grounded in lesbian feminist histories?
Thank you. That's also fascinating. And I also like one of the things I like about what you're doing in the articles, it also seems kind of like a reclamation of the car, which can be so associated with like Fordist production or specific kinds of road trip narratives that perhaps don't move so easily in a kind of queer direction. So I think that's really productive and has a lot of potential for being used and thought through beyond the specific cases that you're looking at in this piece. Can I ask how you came to this topic, either the carness of it or maybe the phone homeness of it all?
Sure, yeah. And I'll just say there's a quick moment in there in the article, like blink and you might miss it, where I reference like grease lightning, and like the chick magnet of the car. Yes, I'm thinking about it in a very different way, or at least I'm trying to illuminate other histories of the car um, that are not that of like the kind of chick magnet thing. Okay, how did I come to this topic? This article comes from a chapter under development for my larger book project, which is called "Coming In: Queer Interiority in American Musical Theater." And in the project, I'm really looking at musicals after the mid 1990s when HIV/AIDS shifts from being classified in the U.S. from a terminal condition to a chronic and condition that's manageable and livable. So I'm really interested in the kinds of new questions that are being opened up for queer political life after the mid 1990s, on the heels of not only gay liberation movement and the HIV/AIDS crisis, but now um, there's been these novel pharmacological interventions that now offer more life, more living, and more aging. So I'm really trying to attend to what are the kinds of questions emerging after the mid 1990s. But what I also am drawn toward is the musical and how the musical becomes a space for working through some of the challenging structures of feeling that are coming on the heels of the 80s and 90s. One of them is a kind of stuckness. So Allison Beck, older Allison in Fun Home describes her feeling of stuckness. That's a musical that, she's writing the graphic memoir during kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, even though it's about a time prior to that. But I think of the musical as kind of very much kind of situated in the post mid 1990s because that's when the graphic memoir was being written. She describes her stuckness. Another example of a musical I write about is Michael R. Jackson's A Strange Loop, which similarly begins with a kind of scene of him being kind of stuck on an empty page where he's writing his musical and there's a cursor blinking. So I'm interested in these scenes of stuckness and how the stuckness opens up to the musical as a form of kind of the interior, and the interior as this space of imagination, of feeling, of thought, deep and critical thought, and ultimately envisioning and crafting narrative futurity. What does that look like? How does musical do that? And how does musical do that through sometimes like singular figures on the stage, but ultimately as musicals, as performance, it's the collective. We're bringing the collective, of the audience and of the ensemble through the space of queer interiority. So that's kind of the larger project. So there's a whole chapter in there focused on Fun Home, and I just was seeing productions of it. I actually directed and choreographed a production of it at Stanford, which I know we'll chat about. But I was seeing productions of it and had just been writing about How I Learned to Drive, one of my favorite plays, and I don't know. I saw one. There was just one production I saw where, like, the moment where in the play, for those who don't know, um, the narrative, the kind of older narrative embodiment, who's typically on the periphery of the stage, at one point she's invited into her memory, and it's a memory of a car ride with her father. And as soon as I saw that moment, which is described in the libretto, it's a very particular mise en scène that's outlined in the libretto. I thought, oh my God, this is like so much reminding me of How I Learned to Drive, and how the mise en scène and How I Learned to Drive is described with the older narrative embodiment. So I just started really thinking about, okay, like Fun Home and How I Learned to Drive, what's the relationship here? What do these, and that just kind of sent me down like a whole rabbit hole of thinking about cars and automobiles and yeah. Yeah, and I'll pause it there.
Great. Well, I mean, if you'd like to talk more about how this connects to your directing and choreographing experience, that would be great. I also, tend to ask about how this project fits into broader concerns of the field, so we could go in either direction. But I'd love to hear more about your experience if you're interested in sharing.
Yeah, I think also part of well, when I directed and choreographed it at Stanford, I was really interested in how to activate the character of older Allison. So, for those who know the musical, who have seen the musical, she's like really on the periphery. And she's, in a certain sense, and Lisa Crone talks about this in the forward to libretto, where really in the play, she thinks and she draws. That's what Crone describes. And it's like, that's the musical. So she's alone, and she's alone with her thoughts. She's alone with her drawings. She's alone with her memories. The musical activates the imaginative life of her space of memory. Um, so I was really interested in finding ways to activate older Allison kind of through on the stage. One of the things I did was do some research on how Alison Bechdel crafted the memoir. And Robert Bernstein has an article about how Alison Bechdel used digital photography to make self portraits of herself posing as the characters of her memory. And so she created these self portraits of herself, like posing as her father, and then she drew her graphic panels based on those self portraits. And there's some images of the self portraits, and they're beautiful. So I just was kind of fascinated by this process that she herself was embodying her father, embodying her mother, embodying her younger self, using her digital camera to take photos of herself doing that, and then she traced. So the musical actually doesn't have any of that in the libretto. There's no discussion of Alison Bechdel's camera or self-portraiture. It's mostly about drawing. I was really curious how we could explore self-portraiture in the musical, and is there some way that I could connect it to an epistemology of the automobile in some sense? So really, what we did was we did explore our older Allison, performed by Lyle Belger, uh, who would take photos of her memories, and then she would produce these Polaroids, and then we had like kind of a wall of Polaroids. But then we also projected images of her posing as the things that she was photographing. And then that went on its own journey so that you kind of saw this dramaturgy of the self-portraiture become this psychic journey into the past and into her future, where she's embodying her memories of herself, but also herself as she's aging. So, so even though again we're not seeing her in a car, I was trying to use some of the ideas in the article that I write to explore the dramaturgy of how she actually crafted this memoir and how we then theatricalized her relationship to her crafting and to the performance of her memories on the stage.
That's really fascinating. I love too how the different layers of photographs seem to index a passage of time and different modes of capturing time as well, which really connects nicely to the progress and the futurity that you were talking about earlier in terms of like, theorizing the automobile and its epistemologies. I don't know if you are interested in talking a little bit more about like how do you see this connecting then, the work that you're doing in this article to broader concerns in the field. So mentioned a few scholars already who you're in dialogue with, but what do you think that you're sort of offering to the way that people are thinking through queer theory or futurities or musicals in our field right now?
Sure, thank you. I think one of the questions I was pursuing as I was developing this article was also a question of where do musicals happen. So I think over the last, we're in 2026 right now. So COVID was this huge shutdown of performance spaces, including Broadway. Um, as we've returned, to the theater, I think we're having increasing conversations about the kind of streaming of performance, but then also the ticket price of what it is to go see a Broadway show. Um, and just a conversation about like the the sense that maybe musicals don't only happen in Broadway theaters. And and many other people maybe grew up sometimes, going on a family trip to New York, but usually you're listening to cast albums. So I do find actually that the experience of driving in an automobile and listening to a cast album is a one way of understanding a place where musicals happen, um, where the musical is imagined in really deep ways by the driver or anyone or the collective, people in the car, um, and and you're actually imagining the musical on your own terms. So I write in the article about how kind of the windshield window framing the road ahead becomes a kind of proscenium stage in a certain sense, where memory and imagination and creative imagination in response to a cast album are working alongside one another. And that helps to also think about how musicals where musicals happen beyond the Broadway stage or even beyond community theaters, in rec centers and high school auditoriums, in basements, but they can happen on the road, in the mountains and deserts, kind of outside of the actual theatrical venue, but inside the interior of a car and interior of the driver's mind. And I just am inviting sort of a conversation about that musicals happen in those scenes as well, and what happens when we think about that as a scene of musical theater. Yeah.
Certainly a scene of musical theater in my household, as my 7 year
Yeah.
old loves to listen to and sing along to her favorites in the car.
Yeah. I'm so curious. What are her favorites? Is it
Right now it's Matilda, the musical.
okay?
I think she
Gorgeous.
sees herself in the kid characters in the
Yeah.
show.
That's actually a
Yeah.
great example of how there is, yes, the listening of the cast album, of becoming really acquainted with those lyrics, and it's a character that you can embody in the car, is different than sitting quietly in the Broadway theater. There is a I love that example, and I'd be really curious to hear what people have their own experiences of that as well.
Yeah, I think it's also, an interesting invitation to attach specific numbers or songs from shows to places. So the song you want to hear as you're driving through a specific city or town or, road trip, an entire road trip playlist, maybe your best of hits. I'd like to see that. That would be fun.
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah.
All right, so last question then. One of my goals with these interviews is to help make scholarship more accessible, both to more general readers and also to undergraduates or graduate students who might be assigned articles in class or reading them for research and finding the written text difficult to parse. So, for those audiences, what are some of the key takeaways that you want readers and our viewers to have when they come away from your piece?
Sure. Thank you. I wrote this article definitely with students in mind. Um, and I teach Introduction to Queer Theory at Stanford. I'm teaching it right now for the second time. I co-taught a version of it a couple years ago with a colleague in the law school. I'm solo teaching it now, but both times I've included a whole week on closets. And just because the scene of the closet is a routine site for queer theory. And so I definitely teach Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet, and students read the whole opening sequence, which is called axiomatic and it's long, but they then also read sort of the classic chapter one, which is where she really develops epistemology of the closet. But I have students really imbibe Sedgwick and parse through what's going on there. Okay, so in addition to Sedgwick and the some of the foundations that Sedgwick lays out with the epistemology of the closet, students also read an essay by Marlon B. Ross called Beyond the Closet as Raceless Paradigm, that's included in a larger book called Black Queer Studies. And then they read an essay by Summer Kim Lee called Staying in Mitski, Ocean Vuong, and Asian American Asociality. So students are reading both kind of the beginnings of some of these ideas from Sedgwick, but then looking at how other scholars in the field are engaging with those ideas through different paradigms, primarily through race. So, in teaching these writers who are themselves engaging with the scene of the closet, I kind of felt like I wanted to return to the scene of the closet, and I'm hopeful that this article, that students in courses, not just in musical theater studies or dramatic literature, but in feminist studies, in queer theory, might engage with the text, because what I also try and offer is a constellation of queer theory itself around time and temporality, around the closet. So I do include my own, reading of Sedgwick, a distillation of Sedgwick through my reading. I include discussion of Jose Esteban Munoz and his responses to Lee Edelman's arguments, which Edelman introduces in his book No Future: Queer Theory and the Death Drive. And then I also touch on the kind of emerging field of queer aging, um, which J. Reed Miller has written about in a very recent issue of GLQ, the Journal of Lesbian and Gay Studies. And Miller positions the kind of subfield of queer aging in relationship to the more clinical subject of queer gerontology. So even though my article is a close reading of a musical, the musical adaptation of Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, I am hopeful that students interested in issues like queer aging or like queer theory or feminist coalitional politics might find those takeaways as well in the article and how they might engage with them in their own research and ideas.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
It's been so wonderful working with Theater Journal and the editors, Christina Baker, Ariel Niersen, and now getting to speak with you, Dr. Chun. I'm very grateful for these opportunity to be in community, and looking forward to people engaging with the whole issue, the whole new issue of Theater Journal that's coming out. So thank you.
Of course, a true pleasure, and we're so excited to be able to feature your work in it. So, for our viewers, just a reminder that I'm here today with Adin Walker, and Walker's article, An Epistemology of the Automobile, Fun Home, Queer Aging, and Lesbian Narrative Futurity on the Musical Stage, can be found in Theater Journal, Volume 78, Issue 2, which is out in June 2026. Thank you again so much for taking the time to talk today. It's been a real treat.
Thank you.